You don't hesitate because you are weak. You hesitate because something in you recognizes what is about to be required. The moment before action is not empty, it is loaded. Your body tightens. Your breath shortens. Your attention fractures. This is not confusion. This is resistance announcing itself. It appears before the first step, not after. Before the hand moves, before the command is executed, before the identity is confirmed. The task itself is rarely the problem. The shift it demands is. To begin is to cross a line where excuses lose authority. Where delay is no longer available. Where you are no longer observing yourself, you are acting. Resistance lives at that border. It is not trying to stop you later. It is trying to stop you now. Because once you start, the version of you that avoids disappears. And something else takes control. Resistance sharpens right before movement because that is the exact moment identity is forced into the open. Before that point, everything is theoretical. You can think about starting. You can plan it, adjust it, delay it, reshape it. None of that costs anything. But the second you begin, the cost becomes real. Your body knows this before your mind explains it. That tightening in your chest, the subtle urge to check something else, the sudden importance of irrelevant tasks, these are not random distractions. They are coordinated signals. They exist to keep you in the current version of yourself. Starting is not a physical action first. It is an identity decision. The moment you move, you eliminate alternatives. You stop being the person who might do it and become the person who is doing it. That shift carries weight. It removes negotiation. It removes softness. And most importantly, it removes the safety of delay. Resistance protects delay. Delay allows you to exist without proof. You can still believe you are disciplined without demonstrating it. You can still claim intention without exposure. The longer you stay there, the more stable that illusion becomes. So when you approach the starting point, resistance intensifies because the illusion is about to collapse. Notice how specific it is. It does not attack the entire task. It targets the first action. Open the file. Put on the shoes. Begin the first repetition. That is where it concentrates its force. Because if the first action happens, the structure follows. Once movement begins, your body aligns. Breathing stabilizes. Focus narrows. The chaos that existed before starting begins to organize itself. Not because the task became easier, but because you crossed the boundary resistance was guarding. This is why the hardest part is always the beginning. Not because the work is overwhelming, but because the identity shift is immediate. Resistance is not there to test your strength. It is there to preserve your current state. It uses friction in the body, heaviness, hesitation, restlessness. It uses noise in the mind, doubt, distraction, unnecessary thinking. It creates a small gap between intention and action, and inside that gap, it gives you options. Every option leads away from starting. Check something first. Adjust your setup. Wait until you feel ready. These are not separate thoughts. They are variations of the same command: remain who you are. If you obey, resistance disappears instantly. Not because it is satisfied, but because its job is complete. You stayed the same. If you ignore it and act anyway, resistance spikes briefly, then collapses. It has no function once movement is established. This is the pattern. Resistance before action. Silence during execution. Most people misinterpret this. They think resistance means something is wrong, that they are not prepared, not motivated, not in the right state. So they wait. They try to fix the feeling before they begin. But the feeling is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that you are at the threshold. And thresholds are not comfortable. They are supposed to create pressure. They are supposed to force a decision. Stay or cross. There is no neutral position here. You either reinforce the current identity by delaying, or you replace it by acting. That is why resistance feels personal. Because it is attached directly to who you are in that moment. Not your goals. Not your plans. Your identity. The mistake is treating it like an obstacle to remove. It is not meant to be removed. It is meant to be ignored. The mistake deepens after you recognize resistance. You begin to watch it. You analyze it. You try to understand why it is there, how to reduce it, how to move around it. This creates a second layer of delay, one that feels productive but changes nothing. Observation becomes another form of avoidance. You stand at the edge, aware of the tension, aware of the hesitation, and instead of moving, you study it. You label it. You try to control it. But resistance does not respond to analysis. It does not negotiate. It does not weaken because you understand it. It remains until action replaces it. This is where most people lose position. Not at the level of effort, but at the level of decision speed. The longer you allow resistance to exist without interruption, the more authority it gains. It starts as a sensation. Then it becomes a suggestion. Then it becomes a reason. And once it becomes a reason, you follow it. I'll start in a minute. I need to get into the right mindset. I'll do it later when I can focus better. These are not decisions. These are exits. Each one preserves your current identity while giving the appearance of control. You are not stopping, you are adjusting. You are not avoiding, you are preparing. But nothing moves. Resistance thrives in that space. It does not need to overpower you. It only needs to slow you down enough that you choose not to act immediately. Time is its advantage. The longer you wait, the more natural it feels to stay where you are. So the structure must be precise. There can be no gap between recognition and movement. The moment resistance is detected, through tension, hesitation, or distraction, the response is not thought. It is action. Immediate, unprocessed, direct. You do not clear your mind. You do not build motivation. You do not negotiate with the feeling. You move. This is not intensity. It is control. Because the longer you remain in that pre-action state, the more variables enter. Doubt expands. Alternatives multiply. Your attention fragments. What was a single action becomes a field of competing options. And inside that field, resistance becomes invisible. It blends into your thinking. It feels like you. That is the danger. When resistance feels like your own voice, you stop questioning it. You follow it as if it were a rational decision. But the pattern is always the same, it leads away from starting. So the correction is not mental clarity. It is compression. You collapse the time between intention and execution until resistance has no space to operate. You decide. You move. No pause. No buffer. This forces a different kind of identity into place. One that does not wait for alignment, does not require comfort, does not depend on internal conditions being stable. It acts first. And when action begins, resistance is cut off at its source. Not gradually. Not partially. Completely. The body shifts. The mind follows. The noise disappears because there is no longer a gap for it to exist in. This is why discipline is not built in long sessions or extreme effort. It is built in that single moment, where resistance appears and is ignored. That moment defines everything that follows. There is a point where resistance no longer feels like hesitation. It feels like logic. Clean, reasonable, almost intelligent. It presents structured arguments, not noise. It tells you why now is not the right time, why the conditions are slightly off, why starting in this exact moment would be inefficient. This is a higher form of the same mechanism. It no longer pushes you away from action through discomfort. It pulls you away through justification. And this is where most people fully lose control, because nothing about it feels like avoidance anymore. It feels correct. You begin to respect the delay. You give it space. You allow it to shape your timing. And in doing so, you hand over authority without noticing. But the structure underneath has not changed. The outcome is the same. You do not start. Resistance does not need to be loud to be effective. In fact, the quieter it becomes, the more dangerous it is. Because it stops triggering urgency. You stop seeing it as something to override. You start treating it as something to consider. And consideration is enough to stop movement. The moment you begin evaluating whether to act, you are already inside the system of resistance. Because action, at its core, does not require evaluation at that stage. The decision has already been made earlier. What remains is execution. But resistance reopens the decision. It takes a closed command and turns it back into a question. Should I do it now? Is this the best time? Would it be better if I waited? These questions are not neutral. They are regressions. They move you backward, from execution to deliberation. And once you are back in deliberation, the original decision loses force. It becomes one option among many. That is how resistance dissolves commitment. Not by breaking it, but by diluting it. So the correction must happen before that reopening occurs. Once the decision is made, it must be treated as irreversible within that moment. There is no return to evaluation. No adjustment. No refinement. Only execution. This creates a hard boundary in your behavior. A line that resistance cannot cross. Because resistance operates by introducing alternatives. And if alternatives are no longer available, it has nothing to attach to. It cannot argue against a command that is already in motion. This is why speed matters, not in how fast you perform the task, but in how fast you initiate it. Delay is the environment resistance requires. Remove the delay, and the structure collapses. You do not need to feel ready. You do not need clarity. You do not need alignment. Those conditions are irrelevant at the point of action. They belong to a different phase. By the time you reach the starting line, all preparation is complete. Whether it was sufficient or not is no longer the question. The only function left is to begin. Resistance will try to convince you otherwise. It will suggest that a little more thinking will improve the outcome. That a small delay will make the process smoother. But smoothness is not the objective. Execution is. And execution begins the moment you stop allowing resistance to convert action into thought. What makes resistance persistent is not its strength, but your willingness to accommodate it in small, unnoticed ways. You do not stop completely. You shift slightly. You adjust timing, posture, sequence. You tell yourself you are still moving forward, but the direction has already changed. These micro-adjustments are not harmless. They create a version of action that avoids the exact point of friction. You begin to circle the task instead of entering it. You prepare longer. You organize more. You refine the setup. Each movement looks valid, but none of them cross the threshold. This is controlled avoidance. And it is more dangerous than direct refusal, because it hides inside behavior that looks disciplined. You are active, but not executing. Resistance evolves to match your standards. If you reject obvious delay, it becomes subtle. If you reject excuses, it becomes structure. It will align itself with whatever you accept, as long as it keeps you from the first irreversible step. So the correction is not to increase effort. It is to remove deviation. The first action must be exact. Not approximate, not symbolic, not a substitute. The real entry point. The moment where the task begins and cannot be reversed into preparation. Anything before that is still outside. You either enter or you don't. This is where precision becomes necessary. You must be able to identify the true starting point without distortion. Not the comfortable version. not the extended version. The exact point where execution replaces intention. Once that point is clear, the rule is simple. No variation. You do not approach it differently based on how you feel. You do not soften it. You do not expand the steps before it. You move directly into it every time. This removes the space where resistance adapts. Because adaptation requires flexibility. And when your behavior becomes fixed at the point of entry, resistance has no surface to attach to. It cannot redirect you if there is only one path. This is where identity stabilizes. Not in long periods of consistency, but in repeated, identical entries into action. The same beginning, executed without negotiation, regardless of internal state. Over time, this compresses resistance even further. It still appears, but it loses influence. It becomes background noise instead of a controlling force. Not because it weakened, but because your response stopped changing. Consistency at the point of start removes variability in outcome. And without variability, resistance cannot evolve. What begins to change is not the presence of resistance, but your relationship to its timing. You start to recognize that it is predictable. It does not appear randomly. It arrives at the same point, under the same conditions, with the same patterns. Right before you start. This predictability removes its disguise. It is no longer something that happens to you. It becomes something that announces the exact location of the threshold. The moment resistance appears, you know precisely where you are, at the edge of execution. This shifts the function of resistance. It stops being a barrier and becomes a marker. But only if your response is fixed. If your response still changes, sometimes acting, sometimes delaying, then resistance remains a controlling force. It continues to influence outcomes because it is still part of your decision process. The transition happens when resistance is no longer allowed to participate in decisions at all. It appears, and nothing about your behavior adjusts. No slowdown. No internal discussion. No shift in posture or pacing. You do not brace against it. You do not try to suppress it. You do not acknowledge it beyond recognition. You proceed exactly as if it were not there. This creates a separation between sensation and action. Your body can register hesitation, but your behavior does not follow it. Your mind can generate alternatives, but they do not alter execution. The internal state continues, but it loses authority over movement. That separation is control. Because control is not the absence of interference. It is the refusal to let interference dictate behavior. At this stage, resistance becomes almost irrelevant. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer connects to outcome. It runs its pattern, but nothing changes in response to it. And without impact, its presence carries no weight. This is where discipline stabilizes into identity. You are no longer someone who overcomes resistance. You are someone who does not factor it in. There is no moment of decision when it appears. That moment has already been removed from the system. The decision exists prior, and execution follows regardless of internal conditions. This removes uncertainty. Not from the task, but from your behavior toward it. And once behavior becomes certain, resistance loses its final leverage. It can still exist. But it cannot stop you. At a certain point, resistance stops presenting itself as a feeling you react to and starts revealing itself as a fixed event in your system. It arrives on schedule. Same tension. Same pull away from the first move. Nothing about it is new. What changes is your position relative to it. You are no longer inside the experience, trying to manage it. You are outside it, recognizing it as part of the sequence. It becomes one step in a chain that always leads to action. Resistance movement. No interruption between the two. This is where most people expect relief. They assume that once discipline is established, the friction disappears. But that never happens. The friction remains exactly where it has always been, at the start. The difference is that it no longer delays anything. Your body can register the weight, the hesitation, the slight pull backward. But there is no pause built around it. No slowing of the sequence. The signal appears, and the next action follows immediately. This removes resistance from the role of decision maker. It becomes background timing. Like a sound that plays before a command executes. It is still there, but it has no authority. It does not alter the command. It does not reshape behavior. It simply occurs. This is a structural shift. Because earlier, resistance was part of the control system. It influenced whether you acted, when you acted, and how you approached the task. Now, it is disconnected from all of that. It has no access. And without access, it cannot interfere. This creates a clean execution loop. The same pattern repeats without variation. You reach the starting point, resistance appears, and action begins anyway. No deviation. No delay. No adjustment. Over time, this loop compresses even further. The gap between resistance and action becomes so small that it is almost indistinguishable. The moment you feel it is the moment you move. There is no observable space where hesitation could expand. This is where consistency becomes automatic. Not because the task is easy, but because the sequence is fixed. There is no longer a version of you that waits. That version has been removed through repetition. Not by force, not by intensity, but by eliminating the gap where it used to exist. And once that gap is gone, resistance has nowhere to operate. It still appears. But it arrives too late to matter. At the final stage, resistance loses even its identity as a separate event. It no longer feels like something opposing you. It becomes embedded in the same motion that overrides it. The moment it appears, it is already being replaced. There is no recognition phase anymore. Earlier, you noticed resistance, then chose to act. That gap, even if small, still existed. Now it is gone. The system does not pause to identify what is happening. It does not label the sensation or register it as something to deal with. It proceeds. This is where execution becomes indifferent. Not emotionally flat, not disconnected, but unaffected. The presence of resistance does not change speed, posture, or direction. It does not trigger correction because there is nothing to correct. The sequence is already set. What used to feel like effort begins to feel mechanical. Not in a lifeless way, but in a controlled, repeatable structure. The same input produces the same output every time. Resistance enters, action follows. No variation. This removes the final layer where most people still struggle, the need to be aware. Awareness is no longer required once the pattern is fixed. You do not need to monitor yourself. You do not need to stay alert for hesitation. The system runs without supervision because there are no alternative paths left inside it. Everything leads forward. At this level, resistance cannot accumulate. It cannot build pressure over time because it is discharged immediately through action. There is no storage, no buildup, no lingering effect that carries into the next moment. Each instance is contained and neutralized in place. This creates a form of stability that does not depend on conditions. Fatigue, distraction, environment, none of these change the entry point. They may affect performance later, but they do not reach the beginning. The start remains untouched. And that is where control is absolute. Because if the start is secured, everything else is forced into motion behind it. You no longer think about beginning. Beginning happens. Automatically, consistently, without interruption. Resistance still exists, but it no longer exists for you. You keep waiting for resistance to disappear. It won't. It was never designed to leave. It was designed to test whether you are still the same. At the beginning, it controls you. It shapes your timing, your decisions, your identity. It tells you when to start, and most of the time, you obey. That is why it feels powerful. But its power was never in force. It was in the gap. The small space between knowing and doing. Between intention and movement. That space is where it lives. That space is where it speaks. That space is where it wins. And the moment you remove that space, everything changes. Not gradually. Not over time. Immediately. You stop negotiating. You stop interpreting. You stop waiting for the right internal state. You move, and in that movement, resistance loses access to you. It still appears, but it no longer connects. That is the shift. You are no longer trying to defeat resistance. You are no longer trying to feel ready. You are no longer trying to align your mind before you act. You act, and everything else follows. This is not intensity. It is not motivation. It is not discipline as effort. It is identity as function. A fixed sequence. A closed loop. A system that does not open itself to interruption. You reach the start, and you begin. Every time. No exception. No variation. No delay. That is where resistance ends. Not because it disappears, but because you no longer give it a place to exist.